I'm really pleased this afternoon to be able to introduce to you the first lecture that the OII is holding in collaboration for the Society for Computers and Law, and to present to you Roger Brownsword, Professor of Law and Director of Telos at King's College London. I'm Vicky Nash at the OII, and part of my role at the OII as a fellow there is to connect our research with policy and practice, but also to connect perhaps with sort of parts of the academic and practitioner communities that we don't actually have as much to do with as we'd like. And one of the things that most appealed to us, I think, about offering this lecture series with SCL was the fact that we could actually connect up academic research in the law area with practicing the practice of law as an ongoing concern. So the point of the series as a whole is to try and introduce to you some of the leading legal scholars whose work focuses on the impact of the internet on law, and whose work asks big questions about perhaps the sort of the future of jurisdictional issues, of ethical issues, principal issues, and to try and actually sort of address those in a way that constructs a dialogue between both academics and practicing lawyers. Roger's work seems to me to be an absolutely excellent way to start this series off, in that he is addressing perhaps some of the sort of the really biggest issues around this area. We're very pleased this evening that he's going to come and deliver some of the work that he's done most recently in his two books, Rights, Regulation and Technological Revolution, and Regulating Technologies.
Well, thanks very much, Vicky, and thanks very much for the invitation to speak here this afternoon. Apologise if you were expecting a PowerPoint presentation. This will just be very old-fashioned. And in the best old-fashioned traditions, I'm going to try and concentrate on 3 points. Let me say by way of preface that lawyers, not surprisingly, tend to be rather preoccupied with the law, and probably a very good thing too. But this narrow focus comes at a certain price. And the first point I want to make this evening, first point I want to speak to, is the importance of lawyers and others attending to the full range of the regulatory environment, as I will call it. Secondly, once you've got the regulatory environment, simply rather than law, in focus, a much broader focus, the regulatory environment, then we need to think about the kind of questions that have to be asked if we are to assess the adequacy of that regulatory environment. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about the reasons why I think lawyers do need to engage much more seriously, both with the regulatory environment and the emergence of new technologies like information technology and biotechnology, but also, of course, neurotechnology, nanotechnology. And I should explain that I'm not a specialist information technology or internet lawyer. My interests are more generic in what's going on in the field of new technologies and how law and regulation is responding to these emerging technological developments. So there are 3 questions, 3 points, 3 questions. One, the nature of the regulatory environment. 2, the questions we need to ask if we are to assess the adequacy of our regulatory environment. And thirdly, the reasons why it's important for lawyers to take an interest in these kind of questions. So, question number 1, what do I mean by a regulatory environment? Well, the first thing for me to say is that in general, a regulatory environment is one that's coded in a certain kind of way for conduct. When we're in a regulated or a regulatory environment, there are certain signals that we are aware of telling us roughly how we ought to behave. It's not just a matter of how we ought to behave, it's also a matter of how we can behave. What's possible? Some environments are constraining, some are supportive by accident. But regulatory environments are no accident. They are a product of intentional design. Regulators put in place a particular kind of environment which they intend to channel or direct or shape or influence our conduct in certain sorts of ways. Characteristically, regulators do this, as I've said, by coding the environment, by putting in place certain signals that indicate what is expected or what's possible. Now, to be more precise about these codes and signals, there are 3 signals in particular that we find in our regulatory environments. First of all, there will be signals telling us what is the right thing to do, what we ought to do or ought not to do if we want to do the right thing. If we're in an environment that is deeply religious or moral, this will be the characteristic signal that we get about the way we should behave. These are the right things to do. Tell me what is the right thing to do. The environment will have certain signals telling us what we should be doing. if we are to do the right thing. Secondly, there will be signals about what we ought to do if we are to act in ways that are in line with our own prudential self-interest, saying this is what you ought to do, again, ought to do, if you are to act in a self-interested way. Law often operates this way. Law, I think, sends out mixed messages. Sometimes it's claiming to tell you what's the right thing to do, categorically the right thing to do. Other times it's simply telling you what you ought to do if you know what's in your interest. But thirdly, regulatory environments also have signals which regulators can put in place that say, this is the only thing you can do. It engages my practical reason, not by telling me what I ought to do, but by making me aware of what is and is not possible within this particular environment. So I know that in this particular room, in this particular environment here, I know that that's the only exit up there. I know that if I want to leave this lecture theatre, I have to go out through that door. At least I think, oh, there might be another option here, but that might be a locked door. But my options are limited. But nevertheless, I don't think this is a regulated environment in that respect, because I don't believe that the architects or anyone else responsible within the institute or the university had some regulatory plan here that they thought it would be a very good thing indeed if we were channeled to leave by that door. I don't think it was regulated in that sense, but there are signals in here telling me about what is and what is not possible. This is also an environment, of course, where the law is in the background. I mean, the law is in the background here. The university has certain, I'm sure, codes of conduct that are also somewhere in the background about appropriate behavior here. And we, as members of a certain sort of academic community, also have our own understanding of what the ground rules are. These are all inputs going into this particular regulatory environment. But the important point is, I repeat again, that the signals we receive here are sometimes normative, telling us what we ought to do as the right thing or what we ought to do by reference to our self-interest. Other times, the signals are simply about possibilities. It's also characteristic of regulatory environments that sometimes they will be felt to be constraining, that uppermost in our minds will be thoughts about what we ought not to do, what is prohibited, where the limits of permission lie. Sometimes, though, the regulatory environments might be supportive. Regulatory environments with intellectual property rights in them, for example, might be supportive of certain sorts of activities. So we shouldn't think that regulatory environments are necessarily constraining. They can be empowering, they can be supportive. And the last thing to say before we move on to the second point, and the last thing about the regulatory environment, is that the inputs into a particular regulatory environment can be quite varied. They're not simply inputs from law or inputs from ethics. They are inputs too from the design, the architecture, also from the technology. These all are factors that go into making up a particular kind of regulatory environment. Sorry, so before we move on to the second question, before I do move on to the second question, I need to say one or two more things about regulation, about regulators, and about law. Let me say a few words about regulation. There's been a great deal of work done on regulation, and regulatory theorists like Christopher Hood, like Julia Black, like Neil Gunningham, have, I think, a fairly shared understanding of what they mean by regulation. Julia Black, for example, says that by regulation, she means the sustained and focused attempt to alter the behavior of others according to standards or goals with the intention of producing a broadly identified outcome or outcomes which may involve mechanisms of standard setting, information gathering, and behavior modification. This idea of setting standards, of directing, and then of monitoring, compliance, detecting, and then of correcting in the case of non-compliance. It's a fairly standard sort of idea that comes with regulatory theory. Now, seminally, Lawrence Lessig, as I'm sure whose name, his work gets widely read within the Institute, Lawrence Lessig, in his celebrated book Code, published 10 years ago, alerts us to the fact that there are different instrumentalities or modalities by which regulation can be imposed upon behavior, regulation within a regulated or regulatory environment. There's law, there's social pressure, there are market financial signals, and there's also code, as he puts it. So that in one of his examples, he's talking about, here as an example of code or design, the law could mandate automatic seatbelts or ignition locking systems, changing the code of the automobile as a means of regulating belting behavior. And he's saying that each action, whether it's law, whether it's peer pressure, whether it's the cost, or whether it's the code, each action might be said to have some effect on seatbelt use. Each has some cost, and the question for government is how to get the most seatbelt use for the least cost. Now, insofar as the regulatory environment and regulation is about law, is about ethics, is about custom and practice, is about market signals, I think we're on fairly familiar territory. But once we start talking about the coding or the design or the architecture of environments, then we're possibly into something rather different. Now, Mireille Hildebrand, who works largely with a group in Brussels but is based in Rotterdam, uses a distinction, or drawn a distinction, between what she calls constitutive and regulative, I think, isn't it? Constitutive and that's right, regulative technological interventions. Language doesn't matter, terminology doesn't matter, but the difference is between those kind of technological features that give you some sort of advice or guidance, like a sat-nav that might suggest the best route for you to take between A and B, or an alcohol detecting device that says it's really not sensible to be driving right now, as against constitutive technologies or constitutive technological interventions that go one stage further and make it impossible for you to act against what would be the advice. So that this is the difference between the sat-nav that simply indicates the preferred route and the sat-nav that immobilizes the vehicle if you try to go against that recommendation. And of course, where technologies are being used in this more obtrusive sort of way, more confining kind of way, then we begin to wonder just what difference this is making to the regulatory environment, how far this is impinging on our autonomy, on a whole range of things that we might value. I don't need to say very much about law, except what I've already said. If this were a jurisprudence lecture, I would be picking over very carefully what I mean by law, how we understand the nature of law, the concept of law, the essence of law. But here it's enough for me to say that by law I mean the kind of things that we already conventionally refer to as the law, whether we're talking about legislation, codes, constitutions, treaties, all the usual stuff that we think represent instruments of law. Nothing very special there. The important point is that lawyers have this narrow focus on law. The only thing they're really interested in, they're obsessed by, is what the law provides for. And as I said at the start, where people are paying you money to advise on the legal position, it's a very good idea that you do stick to advising on the law. Okay, but if we want to understand what makes the world go round, what makes law useful or counterproductive, we have to place it in the broader context of regulatory environments. Law is just one piece, one strand, one input into the environments that are regulatory. Okay, so that's the first thing. That's what I mean roughly by a regulatory environment. If we want to assess whether a regulatory environment is adequate, let me put it no higher than that, then I suggest there are 5 questions we need to ask about a particular regulatory environment. As follows. First of all, whether we think the regulators, and when I say regulators, I mean this can be governmental or non-governmental regulators, can be public, can be private, a whole raft of possible parties trying to shape the environment in a way that will then direct conduct. Whether the regulators' purposes, whether their objectives are legitimate, whether we think they're doing the right kind of thing, whether where they set standards, we think they are the right kind of standards, and when we're talking about the legal position that's being taken up, whether we think that this is a justifiable position to be taken on the particular issue. Do we think, for example, that the relatively permissive legal regimes that we have in some parts of Europe, particularly in the UK, vis-a-vis stem cell research or the like, do we think that these are legitimate positions for regulators to be taking up? Secondly, do we think that the way in which the regulators are going about their regulatory business is the right kind of way for them to be doing their regulatory business? Again, this is a question of legitimacy. Do we think they're doing the right kind of thing in the right kind of way? Thirdly, are regulatory interventions, is the regulatory environment fit for purpose? Does it work? Relative to the regulator's objectives, relative to their purposes, does it steer conduct in the way that is intended? Law is notoriously counterproductive vis-a-vis regulators' purposes. Law often does not have at all the effect that regulators intend. So the third question is whether it's effective, whether it's fit for purpose. Fourthly, and a question that is particularly pertinent where we're dealing with rapidly developing and then moving on new technologies, is the regulatory environment properly connected to the technology? Is there a good fit? Is it properly connected? Is it engaged in the way that it should be? Because notoriously, technologies move on very rapidly, leaving particularly legal interventions way behind. And that's true whether you're looking at data protection, whether you're looking at human fertilization, embryology, a whole raft of new technologies simply move on, leaving their legal frameworks trailing in the wake. And finally, the fifth question we need to ask is whether our regulatory environments in a world of global governance, whether these regulatory environments match up to what I call cosmopolitan ideals. Do they satisfy cosmopolitan ideals? So there are questions about whether regulators are trying to do the right kind of thing, whether they're going about it in the right kind of way, whether what they're doing is going to be effective, whether what they're doing is properly connected, and whether what they're doing is in line with cosmopolitan values. And cosmopolitanism is, again, a cluster of concerns about both legitimacy and effectiveness. Now, I'll say a few words about each of these five questions, because each in itself represents a challenge to regulators, a major challenge. I don't expect regulators to score maximum points on each of these criteria. And indeed, you can often sense there's a serious tension between, for example, attempts to do things more effectively in relation to the third criterion, and doing things the right kind of way in relation to the second criterion. Effectiveness and legitimacy often cut against one another. Okay. But first of all, the question of whether we think regulators are at least pursuing legitimate ends or purposes, whether the standards that are set, where standards are set, whether these are legitimate. I've written a lot about the debates relating to the legitimacy of regulation in relation to biotechnology. Here we find the divisions are much more conflictual, much more serious, I think, than in relation to information technology. In relation to biotechnology, we find there are three principal constituencies that are contesting the regulation persistently. When I was advising the House of Commons Science and Technology Committee a couple of years ago for their work on hybrid embryos, Phil Willis, who was the chair of the committee, said one day, can you give the members of the committee a 5-minute tutorial on the ethical landscape? Now, a 5-minute tutorial on the ethical landscape is just, not possible. We need 5 books, not 5 minutes. But this is basically what I would say if you want it on the back of a postcard. Essentially, people start from one of 3 formal positions. They either think that what matters are certain goals, okay, or they think that the right thing to do relates to respect for certain rights, or they start with the idea of the importance, primacy of individual duties. So just like you have Conservative, Liberal Democrat, Labour sitting in the Parliamentary Assembly here, we have goals people, rights people, duty people. But these are just shells, and they need to be substantively articulated in a particular way before they have a distinctive meaning. So that, for example, with goals, it might be utility, it might be human welfare, that is the thing that the theorists reckon should be maximized, or it might be equality, it might be all sorts of goals. With rights, again, the particular array of rights that's put in might be characteristic of a kind of human rights agenda that we have these days, or it might be something rather different. And again, with duties, we find that the duties that are enumerated can be very different. But in the area of bioethics and debates about biotechnology, and now we see debates about nanomedicine, any kind of technology that impinges on humans, we find that the leading articulations of these 3 basic views of molds are a utilitarian view, which just calculates in a kind of cost-benefit way which options will seem to promise to maximize utility. We have against that the human rights view, which is always insisting that utilitarian calculations have to be moderated, have to be constrained by concerns for individual rights. And we have, and this is the distinctive voice in the bioethics debates, modern bioethics debates, we have people who argue that the most fundamental duty is to make sure that we do not compromise human dignity, the dignitarians. And so, for example, in debates about human enhancement, we have someone like Michael Sandel in the States, in his recent book, The Case Against Perfection, arguing a dignitarian view, saying that we simply should not be going down this track at all. These are things we should not be doing, trying to enhance humans. No, that's not at all the thing that we should, that's a very bad thing to be doing, absolutely wrong. We have someone like John Harris, who's probably one of the leading utilitarian bioethicists in the UK, arguing in a very robust way for, well, in fact, we have a duty to utilize, to innovate with enhancement. And then we have more cautious views from the human rights constituency who are concerned about privacy and one thing and another. And within the human rights constituency, characteristically, the issue here is about whether we have informed consent properly in place. People have rights. They can authorize what would otherwise be rights violations by giving their consent. But informed consent becomes an absolutely critical issue within that third perspective, within the rights perspective. Now, this three-way contest between the utilitarians, the rights theorists, and the dignitarians is not something that, generally speaking, I think you find breaking out within debates about information technology. I mean, here, there are going to be rights concerns, particularly concerns about privacy, about confidentiality. The debates on, the data protection debates are quintessentially debates, I think, about these kind of rights and whether they are being properly respected. Those people who would say, I mean, Ian's been involved in this very recently, but those people who would say, look, the data we have in these databases needs to be joined up for the greater public good, for public health, for medical reasons, for criminal justice reasons. Characteristically, they are arguing in a utilitarian sort of way, and they're being opposed by rights theorists. The dignitarians, for the most part, do not have much to say about those debates. But as soon as the technology, in the form of implants or the like, starts impinging on humans and what we think we might be as human beings, then the dignitarians start taking interest and saying, hang on a minute, these are things we categorically should not do. And just as Ian's report on Database Britain was traffic light coding the databases, the particular databases, I would say you could use a similar sort of schema to characterize where these three leading ethical voices are in relation to traffic lights. That is to say that by and large the utilitarians are green light. They are saying go right ahead. Unless something is extremely and extraordinarily risky, they will say go right ahead. Human rights people are amber light people. They will say, hang on a minute, pause here just to check that we have proper rights clearance before you proceed. And the dignitarians are the only group who are saying categorically no in a red light way. Dignitarians are the real red light ethicists around, okay? They're not saying, okay, provided, it is categorically no. And you find this, I repeat, very much in biotechnology, whether you're talking about human biotechnology, human genetics, whether you're talking about GMOs. You're going to find it in nanotechnology, where we're talking about nanomedical interventions, in neurotechnology, where we're now talking about the possible uses of brain imaging and this kind of thing. Again, the dignitarians are really actively involved in those debates because they think that scanning people, holding a mirror up to ourselves, we won't like what we see, and this is a place we should not go. Whereas in information technology, although there are some dignitarian concerns about the kind of online content, for example, by and large, dignitarians don't have such a prominent voice, I would say, within the area of information technology. So the first issue is whether you think the regulators are trying to do the right kind of thing. Is the regulatory environment properly geared? Well, it depends where you stand in relation to these three ethics. Now, the second of the 5 criteria is whether you think the regulators are going about their regulatory business in the right kind of way. Here we need to look, first of all, at the kind of relationship that regulators have with their regulatees, particularly where the regulation is in the public sphere. We expect regulators to operate in transparent ways, to be accountable, and to be pretty inclusive with their publics, with their regulatees, before they establish a particular regulatory position. So we would expect public engagement on biotechnology or a whole raft of emerging technologies where we feel that there needs to be a debate before a position is taken up. And here there are some extreme difficulties about specialization, about divisions of labor. Some people would argue that these technologies, because they are just the province, the sphere of real local expertise, have to be left largely to the experts before the public becomes involved. But against that, there is the view that we need to have the public fully engaged with these technologies right from the start. I'm not quite sure how feasible that is, but certainly I think the view that you can keep the public away from these debates because they just don't have anything useful to contribute is seriously misconceived. That, I mean, it's true that the experts are an elite with, by definition, ex hypothesi, the expert knowledge, but experts, even though they understand the technology, are not the only voices in telling us what's acceptable in the way of risk, for example, what's acceptable culturally. So, for example, in a special issue on nanotechnology a year or two ago, a couple of American writers put the point in the following way. They say science and industry experts have an important role to play. They are well positioned to see what is possible, what's feasible, and what is required to achieve certain economic and technological ends. They thereby play a crucial informational role. But knowledge of what can and cannot be done, what is and is not required to do it, is quite different from knowledge of what ought and ought not to be done. What ends should be prioritized, how resources should be allocated in pursuit of those ends, and constraints on how those ends ought to be pursued are ethical and social questions to be addressed in the public sphere. So while scientists and industry leaders may be the elite in their knowledge of the science and the business of nanotechnology, this status does not imply that they are the elite with respect to the social and ethical issues associated with nanotechnology. Okay, so one part of the challenge of regulators going about their business in the right kind of way is not to keep the regulations secret, to keep it a closed shop behind closed doors. They need to open up, it needs to be transparent, the public needs to be brought on board. But quite how you do that is not straightforward, because regulatory projects can get seriously derailed once the public become involved. Sometimes the public don't like the prospect of this particular technological innovation. Sometimes it won't be supported. And of course, the case of GM in Europe is a textbook example of that. Well, the other dimension of this is really very much the focus of what I'm about here. And that is that where regulators start turning to the technology, to these emerging technologies, as the way they are going to do their regulatory business, it's not here a question of whether this is a more effective way of doing it, but whether this is an acceptable way of regulating the environment. Where technological fixes are being used, or technological supports, this changes quite significantly the nature of the environment that we are inhabiting. So, for example, again, I can turn to a couple of American contributors who are talking here about DNA profiling and saying, look, when we have debates about DNA profiling, we shouldn't just take this in isolation any more than we should take the databases in isolation. This is part of a whole apparatus of new technology that is being brought to bear, okay, either on security or on criminal justice, basically on controlling the way people behave. So they say that the prospect of expanded use of DNA forensics needs to be placed in context. In a world in which personal privacy is difficult to maintain against an onslaught of computer file sharing, surveillance cameras, biometric imaging, thermal imaging, and other technological, in quotes, advances, for many people, the last off-limit area for access to personal information is law enforcement. You know, we are in the vanguard in the UK of this kind of society. Our DNA database, well, even with some profiles taken off it, is probably still going to be one of the largest per capita collections in the world. You know, it's said that people in London are commonly captured on CCTV at least 300 times a day. There are millions of CCTV cameras around. We're talking about, you know, biometrics. We're talking, I mean, the whole apparatus of tracking, locating, surveilling, you know, identifying is now being routinely embedded in our regulatory environments. It's not there by accident, it's there by design, okay? And it will have an impact on the kind of place that we populate. Now, moving on to I'll come back to this in a few minutes, but moving on to the third criterion, this is the criterion of regulatory effectiveness. And an awful lot of very good work has been done, I think, by regulatory theorists who've tried to correct for some very simple assumptions that we make about what works and what does not work. The regulatory theorists say that, we need to be smarter, we need to be more responsive, we need to understand the full array of instruments that can be used to achieve the regulator's purposes, that the best combinations of regulatory instruments need to be employed, and so on. And this is all good stuff. I mean, it doesn't mean that we have off-the-shelf answers. Our regulatory intelligence is still here, very primitive indeed. But insofar as we're trying to organize our thinking about regulatory failure and regulatory effectiveness, I suggest that there are three main places where regulation can be derailed, where it can be ineffective. And there are actually quite nice illustrations of each of these problems in this area of IT. So first of all, the problem can be with the regulators themselves. Oh, let me just, before I say this, let me just say that if you think of simple, just imagine a shepherd, a farmer, trying to herd sheep around a course in the way that used to be a feature in a particular television program. It was a bit of a cult television program here in the UK. What can go wrong? Well, the farmer or the shepherd can be pretty poor at doing his job. I mean, that could be one thing, or secondly, it can be the sheep or the dogs are not too interested on the day in complying with the whistles and the signals that are being given. Or it could be, as I remember in one of these programs, that the problem was a ferocious wind that was blowing across the field, so that there were kind of externalities that were interfering with the farmer's project. And okay, so the three areas where things can go wrong. And as you look at the research, which is sort of checking on the impact of particular regulatory interventions, nearly always the problem is going to be located in one or more of these three loci. First of all, the regulators themselves, they can be the problem. They can be corrupt. They can be captured. All right? They might have inadequate resourcing. Our information commissioner has an annual budget, I think, of about £10 million. And so his office, Richard Thomas's office, on £10 million, has to look after data protection and freedom of information. Okay? If ever the government manages to recover any of Sir Fred's pension, then I think, the £8 million or whatever it is they get back might well be applied, for the benefit of the Information Commissioner's office. It could do with a bigger budget. How is it supposed to perform on this kind of money? I mean, it can set standards, it can issue codes of conduct, it can give guidance, but monitoring, correcting, it just doesn't have the resources to do that in a serious sort of way. So the problems with regulators here, regulators often are not clear about their own purposes. I did some work with the Brain Science, Addiction and Drugs group in the Academy of Medical Sciences, where one of our concerns was with the regulation of recreational drug use. And here I don't think regulators are clear about what they should be doing about recreational drug use, whether it's a health problem, whether it's a crime problem. I mean, without being clear about these things, regulatory interventions just seesaw or, they vacillate. They don't have clear direction. In the area of information technology, Chris Reed has written about the failure of the Electronic Signatures Directive to have much impact because the regulators there just had a serious misunderstanding about business models and the way that the Signatures Directive would actually impact on business practice. Andrew Murray's written in his book, Regulating Cyberspace, about the complexity of internet networks. And again, regulators miscalculate just how their interventions are going to play in these more complex environments. But it might not be the regulators who are the problem. The regulators might be doing a pretty good job and know what they're trying to do. The problem might be with the regulatees. And there are cultures of non-compliance all over the place. People have groups, professions in particular, have their own imperatives, have their own practices. Medics, lawyers, I wouldn't exempt lawyers, have their own ideas of how things should be done. If regulators try to cut across the grain of these practices, they're going to find resistance or token compliance. I mean, this is just the nature of things. In the area of information technology, what is the most spectacular example of a regulatory intervention being resisted, I guess it's in relation to peer-to-peer file sharing. I mean, regulators just don't buy the idea that they should not be file sharing. What's wrong with it? They don't see that there's anything seriously wrong with this. So, regulation just doesn't cut any ice there. And then, of course, the third possibility is that even if regulators are doing a fine job, and regulatees are trying to go along with it, trying to conform to the regulation, there might still be some externalities that get in the way, that interfere with this. And again, in the area of information technology, I mean, within the European Union, it might well be that the regulation of spamming is, pretty well controlled, reasonable compliance. But where spam is being sent from outside the European Union, as I think most of it is, then it's outside the area of regulatory control, and that cuts right across the attempts of regulators here in Europe to effectively do their job. Sorry, just noticing the clock moving on. Regulatory connection is the fourth challenge for regulators, and the fourth question we should ask about the regulatory environment. Is the regulatory environment properly connected? Now, there are examples of quite serious disconnection. Many people think that in the area of data protection and information technology, we have serious disconnection now. I mean, certainly, the first generation of data protection regulation imagined a world of big mainframe computers, very visible data controllers. To talk about data controllers and data processing, well, I mean, we knew who they were, we knew what it was. It was regulable, as it were. Things have changed a lot. Data protection regulations had to change with it, but people again now are raising the question of whether we need a further round of regulation to catch up with the technology. In biotech, as I said earlier on, in the area of human embryology, the 1990 Human Fertilization and Embryology Act, an act that was taken to be a model for the rest of the world, was rapidly outstripped by developments in embryology, in pre-implantation genetic diagnosis and so on, in therapeutic cloning. A whole raft of developments there that left the legislation stranded. And of course the irony is, and I saw this particularly in Parliament recently with the revision of the Act, the more that the regulators try to be absolutely precise about the drafting of, in this case, legislation, so that it perfectly captures, perfectly maps onto the technology as it is today, then you can be sure that drafting is going to be out of touch tomorrow. The more precise you try to be today, the less chance you have of keeping it connected for tomorrow. At the moment, there's a lot of concern about whether we need some bespoke regulation for nanotechnology. There's also a lot of concern about whether we should have some bespoke regulation for RFID. Now, someone in I was at a meeting in Brussels last year when one of the Commission people said, "Do we need regulation for RFID?" Now, the answer to this is that, in a sense, we already do have regulation. We don't have bespoke regulation, but there's an awful lot of regulation out there. And it's rarely the case that some technological innovation will fall into a complete regulatory void. I mean, on the negative side, we have a whole raft of regulation that is designed to ensure that the risks to health and safety and the environment are minimized. We have procedures for informed consent. We have product liability, tort claims where things go wrong, where compensation can be awarded. And on the positive side, we have, of course, intellectual property regimes, patent regimes in particular, to incentivize the development of the technology. And we have taxation and competition and consumer laws, which again are contract laws, which can facilitate the circulation and allocation of these technological applications. It's not as though there's no regulation. The question of whether we need some bespoke regulation is the issue. I mean, this is always quite tricky, because when the technology is in an emergent state, as is the case at the moment with nanotechnologies, it's not quite clear what that bespoke regulation should be directed at. And as I've said earlier on, one of the problems with regulation and regulatory environments is that regulators are not always clear what they're trying to do. So they do need to have some clarity about what it is they want to try to achieve with a regulatory intervention. And often with emergent technologies, we don't know quite what that should be. So there are real difficulties there. And again, how precisely you manage to create regulation that succeeds in giving clear guidance and yet at the same time has the flexibility built into it that enables it to go along with technological development. Well, there's a lot more to say about that, but I rushed through that one rather to get to the fifth and final issue of the adequacy of a regulatory environment, which is whether the regulatory environment passes muster by reference to cosmopolitan standards. Now, by cosmopolitan standards, I mean that on the one hand, we aspire to do things in a way that is in line with universal or fundamental values, but at the same time, we also want to leave room for, as they say, legitimate local difference. It's this idea that we should respect cultural diversity where it's legitimate, but at the same time, we want to try to respect fundamental values. A difficult dilemma because it already suggests quite a tension between these two demands. And we see these cosmopolitan conundrums being played out in trade regimes where the WTO, for example, has to make decisions in the context of a trade regime about local exception. We see it again in Europe in relation to patent regimes. We see it in many places where trade is the issue, but we also see it culturally. And we see this in Europe with the commitments we have under the European Convention on Human Rights. And let me, in this context, just say a few words about the recent MARPA decision in Strasbourg, because again, this is something that connects up to what was in the news last week, where Ian's group were reporting on the DNA profile database. Now, as you probably know, the UK has a legislative regime which allows the police to take samples from anyone who is arrested for a recordable offence. That's pretty much anybody who's arrested. And to make a profile from that sample. The sample and the profile can be and is normally retained, even though the person from whom that sample has been taken has not been convicted of any particular offence. Now, I think back in about 2000 or 2001, two people in Sheffield in a test case launched proceedings designed to challenge our legislative framework for this, arguing that this framework was not compatible with our human rights commitments, and in particular not compatible with our commitments under Article 8, the privacy article of the European Convention on Human Rights. The two individuals concerned, in one case, the guy, the proceedings were discontinued against him, and in the other case, a teenage boy was not actually convicted. He was acquitted. The chief constable declined to remove their profiles, which under the law he was entitled to do. And when the challenges ran through the domestic courts here, in both the Court of Appeal and the House of Lords, the judges there took the view that although Article 8.1, the privacy article, was engaged, though as Lord Steyne put it, rather weakly engaged, nevertheless, the kind of reasons that are available to the contracting states under, in this case, Article 8.2, to override the privacy right, were compelling reasons. These are reasons about criminal justice and so on. These were seen to be powerful overriding reasons. When this case went to Strasbourg, the Grand Chamber decided unanimously that we were seriously out of step with our co-contractors under the European Convention and that we needed to come back into line. Now, the Strasbourg judgment does not tell us precisely how we should do that. The issue is remitted back here to the UK to do the right thing, as it were. But the question is, what now is the right thing for the government to do? The House of Lords Constitution Committee says that it hopes that the government will take rapid and swift steps to come into line with Strasbourg. And although in the Roundtree report, precisely what should be done is not, I think, spelled out, but this is a database that is marked red and it clearly requires corrective action at the very least. But there are two ways in which the government might respond to this, and I suspect the first way is the way that they will, because they clearly regard the DNA database as an important resource in the fight against crime. Well, I think that the first response is to say, look, within the European Convention on Human Rights, we're a kind of club. We've been found wanting by Strasbourg in the sense that we are out of line with other club members. There's nothing more than that. So long as we bring our local law back into line with some of these other members, and Denmark and France have, I think, in respectively 10 and 25 years retention periods for their profiles, provided we do that, then we're back in the pack and everything will be fine. Now, this would be the minimal response, okay? Now, you might say, well, that's not really the spirit of Strasbourg, is it? Because surely there's more at stake here. This is about fundamental values, about human rights, okay? And this goes beyond the commitments of the signatories to the European Convention on Human Rights. This is something that binds all humans. And if we are to approach the matter in that way, I think actually we'd be quite disappointed with the Strasbourg judgment because it's not particularly strong on that side of things. But we'd also be very disappointed then with the UK government's response if the UK were to say, well, all we have to do is move back into line with these other contracting states, rather than take the privacy right seriously in the way that a universalist would say we should do. Well, I've now got to the third and final question. Vicky, I'll just, how many minutes would you like me just, sorry, I'm conscious that, yeah, let me just, yeah. This is the question about why lawyers should really get interested in these issues. And the clue to this is in what I've already said, that I think that technology is going to be increasingly relied on by regulators when they try to design regulatory environments for us. That these emerging technologies hold out huge potential for surveillance and for obstruction and for channeling human conduct. There are a number of questions I'd like to ask about this, but let me just highlight the difference between what I call a panopticon use of the technologies and a preclusionary or an exclusionary use. Now, with panopticonism, imagine that the technologies have reached a point where the state will be able to detect every violation of its criminal code, or indeed any other regulation you like to name. It can always detect, it can always identify who is responsible, who's going to who stepped out of line. Okay? It is the ultimate surveillance society. Now, if the regulation or the code that's being enforced this way is in line with whatever moral values we like to specify, you might think, well, why should we worry about that? Isn't that a jolly good thing? I mean, for years we've bemoaned the fact, or criminologists have bemoaned the fact, that nothing works. Here we have something that looks as though it might work. Why should we then be agonizing about it? Well, the reason why we should agonize about it, I think, goes back to those signals that I was trying to identify as characteristic of regulatory environments right at the start. That the three signals we get: you ought not to do this because this is the wrong thing to do. You ought not to do this because this would be against your self-interest. It wouldn't be prudent. You cannot do this. Okay? Now, where the coding becomes panopticon, although I can still do it, right? No one is telling me really I ought not to do it because it's the wrong thing to do. There's no moral message there. It's just, look, if you do this, you're going to be detected, you're going to be punished. Okay? So all the pressure on me, the key motivation, is prudential. I'm just thinking prudentially. Or you might say, well, God, this sounds highly idealistic. Surely this is the way most people think anyway. I mean, when people comply with the criminal law, aren't they thinking prudentially anyway? Well, it may well be the case, but the aspiration of a moral community is to develop moral virtues. We want people doing the right thing because they think that this is the right thing to do. Even if the criminal code does map neatly onto our moral values, the reason then why people are doing these things is because they're worried about detection and conviction and all the rest of it. They're worried about their prudential interests. They're not being driven by moral concerns. Now, if we take Panopticanism one stage further. If the design of the regulatory environment is such, not that I simply am aware that if I step out of line, I will be detected, but if instead I'm not offered the option anymore, right? Things are designed in such a way that it is no longer possible for me to commit what was previously the criminal offence. The only option is to conduct myself in a way that's in accordance with the decreed regulatory pattern of behaviour. Then the message is not, you ought not to do this because this is the wrong thing to do. It's not even, you ought not to do this because it wouldn't be prudent to do it. The message is, you can't do this. You just can't do it. And of course, this is what Lawrence Lessig in his work on code is emphasizing in the way that private regulators, through passwording and coding of software and hardware, are able to fix things so that you just can't do it. Now, where you're talking about digital rights management or intellectual property rights, stopping people doing it, saying you can't do this, you might think, well, has this got something going for it, at least as long as there's no overreaching of those rights. But when you transplant that into public life more generally, so that in our daily lives, we're confronted all the time with environments which simply do not allow us to do these things, then we bypass the normative dimension of practical reason altogether. Regulators now simply don't say you ought not to do these things anymore. That's the end of law, that's the end of morality, that's the end of virtue. And that's not a future that I would particularly welcome. And I don't think it's a future that anyone with any moral aspirations can welcome. My colleague in King's, Jonathan Glover, says, oh, you exaggerate. Yeah, there would still be plenty of space for the cultivation of moral virtue. And he may well be right. I mean, maybe the moral life of the community would not be squeezed out by these technological interventions. But it worries me in the public domain in the way that I think it worries Lawrence Lessig in the private domain. There is a very good report by the US President's Council on Bioethics about techniques of human enhancement and how we should regard these techniques. A report called Beyond Therapy, going back to 2003. And in one passage in the report, the President's Council is reflecting on the way that troublesome children are freely administered Ritalin and the like to try and control their behaviour. And this is worth reading. Okay, the concern here is this, that behaviour-modifying agents circumvent the process of self-control and progressive moral education. They act directly on the brain to affect the child's behaviour without intervening learning processes. If what matters is only the child's outward behaviour, then this is simply a more effective and efficient means of achieving the desired result. But because moral education is typically more about the shaping of the agent's character than about the outward act, the process of learning to behave appropriately matters most of all. And so on and so on. Okay. It's a worry that the technological fix, which is effective, undercuts some of the other objectives we have in morally directed societies. Well, there's an awful lot more to say. I would have said something about Jonathan Zittrain along the way, because one of the Jonathan's, Oxford philosophers are obsessed, aren't they, about problems about cutting the corners on the grassed areas in the quadrangles. Oxford moral philosophy has almost been built, I think, on these puzzles about, whether it's right for people to cut across the grass when there's no trace left the following morning, that kind of thing. Well, Jonathan says in one of his articles, how about just kind of designing out the problem by having a flagged paving stones on the line that people actually want to walk? Why try and channel them round? Why don't you just design in the way that they want to behave without spoiling the grass? And of course, it's tempting to do this. But in the end, whether these technological, well, I mean, it's just low tech, but whether these technological responses to our problems really are satisfactory is a question of some detail. And there's an awful lot of devil in the detail about the particular designs that we use. Now, young lawyers are advised that they should make their 3 essential points shortly, sharply, crisply. Don't tax the patience of the court. And I'm sorry, I know I'm conscious here I've overtaxed you on this one, but let me just summarize and say that there are 3 essential points here. Number 1 is about the importance of regulatory environments. And when the G20 ministers are meeting in London this week, to talk about redesigning the regulatory environment for an international financial system that's in free-falling crisis, I don't think anybody can doubt the importance of getting the regulatory environment right. And it's not just the law that matters there, I repeat. The regulatory environment has the full array that channels and directs our conduct. It matters. Secondly, I don't want to say that technological innovation is an unconditional or an unqualified good, but I do think that technological innovation can support and respond to some of the deepest global problems we have. It might help with things like the environment, with water, with food. It might help with human health and well-being. And for particular cultures, it might enable them in the way of communication, education, entertainment, reproduction, in ways that are in line with their values. It can be a force for the good. I don't mean to say that it's only high-tech that can be a force for the good. Low-tech can be too. But whatever I think about these things, I believe we are on a technological trajectory. We are by nature fairly innovative, and I think that the 21st century, as in the 20th century, will continue to be a period of accelerating technological innovation. That's the nature, I think, of the reality. So regulatory environments matter. Technological innovation will accelerate, expand. And the third point is that lawyers need to take an interest in these matters, that lawyers don't do themselves any favors by focusing just narrowly and exclusively on what the law provides. Sometimes legal adjustments do matter, but often they will not. They'll be compensated or neutralized within the regulatory environment. No, lawyers need to think about more than the law. In short, they need to think about regulatory environments, and they need to think about technological innovation and the way technology and regulation come together. Okay.
Thank you, Roger. It's a pleasure to hear you speak. I think the breadth of disciplinary frameworks that you bring to this question, I think, is really vital. I think this overarching conception of regulation as going much further than law is really critical, especially in such a world of fast-moving technology. I think perhaps John Braithwaite's the only other person that does it as well as you. Just to try to make 5 snappy points. I think one of the key issues I come across a lot in thinking through these issues is the public policy and political science angle of this. How is law actually made in practice? Bill has written about ecologies of games, about the ways different stakeholders battle with each other as legislation is made, as primary legislation is made, as secondary legislation is made, as regulatory agencies like Ofcom, for example, are persuaded to do things, for example, as they are considering right now, setting up a digital rights agency and effectively taxing internet provision to provide funds to compensate rights holders. You mentioned the war on drugs. I think, as The Economist called it just a week or two ago, this murderous, illiberal and ineffective failed policy. And yet a century later is still going strong. We certainly get resistance and token compliance to regulation from the private sector. I think we actually get it also from governments. As you said, our UK government is trying very hard to resist the MARPA decision of the European Court. Their latest move, actually, you may not have even seen this because it was very recent. They've proposed amendments to the latest Criminal and Justice Bill, which basically sets up a regime that will be entirely through secondary legislation that they decide how the database will run. And if you have anything to do at all in public policy with secondary legislation, you'll know as the Labour chief whip told an astonished Lords a few years back, when looking at the regulation of investigatory powers secondary legislation and whether local councils should have the power to use these very invasive powers against people who were, for example, selling unlicensed pot plants, allowing their dogs to foul the street, trying to get their children into schools outside the catchment area of where they lived. The Labour chief whip told the Lords that Labour enough Conservatives and crossbenchers had turned up to defeat this code of practice, and he said, we have long memories. One day you will be in power, we will be on this bench, and if you overturn this piece of secondary legislation today, which by convention the Lords does not do, it's the 1960s the last time that happened, he said, we will do this to every piece of secondary legislation the Conservatives brought forward at the next election. So the practical politics of it. I think that's one of the reasons that law perhaps has less legitimacy amongst the public than it used to, that people are increasingly aware of how far private interests, very concentrated often, private interests are driving the development of the law. And that links into the digital rights management side as well, that if people felt that copyright law as it exists today, in a much more draconian form than it was created in the 18th century in the UK and in the US, if people thought it was perhaps a bit fairer to the interests of users of copyright works as opposed to rights holders, they might be less upset at technology that tries to stop them using entirely legitimate fair dealing exceptions in copyright law to, for example, in countries, not the UK, but most other countries have a private use exemption that says it's fine for you to put your CD music on your iPod. I guess most of the people in the room are probably breaking that one. I didn't start by asking who hasn't broken the law today, but I wouldn't think it would be many people in this country. I think the issue of technocrats versus public dialogue is an interesting one. I absolutely would agree that it's not morally legitimate to say, oh, this is such a complex, fast-moving technological area, you must leave it entirely to the experts. In the information technology world, that's a very common... The opposite is very commonly held. You very commonly meet people who are very smart programmers, very smart designers of internet technologies, who mistake their expertise on technology with expertise in morality and many of the other issues that you were discussing. It seems to be hard to bridge those two worlds, unfortunately. Some groups do try, but so far I haven't seen many examples of major successes at that. I think actually one you briefly mentioned, the European Commission's RFID consultation over the last couple of years has been a good example of that, where the Commission has brought together a lot of different stakeholders, has spent several years putting forward drafts, thinking about codes of conduct, but actually also at the same time thinking about mechanisms to enforce these codes once they're introduced. So the European Data Protection Supervisor, for example, has proposed that the Commission use some, I don't know how he found this, some very obscure, a very obscure telecoms directive from 1999, which, actually this gives the Commission the power to regulate devices which you could probably call RFIDs in the interests of A, B, C data protection. So they are actively exploring that issue. Some couple of wider points. The principles versus the more technology-specific regulation, I think, is interesting. On the data protection side, the Commission is actually right now in its thinking phase, it says, about whether the Data Protection Directive needs to be updated in the light of new technologies. I'm actually advising them on it. And I think on the principles side, no. I think actually the 8 data protection principles have lasted remarkably well. I mean, they date back to the 70s, not just to 1995 when the directive was passed. Whether the more specific directives, like the Directive on Privacy and Electronic Communications, which talks about very specific things like spam and cookies, for example, will last nearly as long, I really don't know. One point of yours I wasn't sure about if I would include intention as a defining feature of regulation. If you've read the work of Helen Nissenbaum, for example, and in how technologies are never value-free, they always embed certain values, whether the designers are consciously trying to embed those values or not. I think it's useful to think that through and to think, okay, well, how do you address the careless designers as well as the purposeful regulators? Finally, the panopticism and control, the Jeremy Bentham. I mean, of course, the debate about is human rights nonsense on stilts goes back to at least to Bentham and beyond. It's a much wider debate in philosophy and law. The moral development, I like that angle, and that actually, going back to the multidisciplinary point, is I remember well from my psychology degree about how children develop morality in a very practical way, as an empirical scientific matter rather than as a matter of philosophy and ethics, and very much so. If you look at, one of the most widely used psychological models of child ethical development sort of starts off with the, children start at the ostrich phase, where if they stick their head in the ground and you can't see them, then they can do no wrong. And it moves on to, I forget exactly what they call it now, conventional morality, where as long as the law says something is right, then it's right, and if the law says something is wrong, then it's wrong. And actually, this may sound very patronizing. This is how the psychologists who developed this model describe it. Many adults remain at that stage throughout adulthood, that right and wrong is defined purely by what the law says or what other systems of rules said. But of course, then the final stage that they describe in this model is post-conventional morality, where people are thinking through the ethics in a much more detailed way. You know, the standard example that's used is I have a dying wife and I can't afford the life-saving drugs that would save her. Is it right or wrong for me to break into the pharmacy around the corner? And I think that moral development and that link to whether technology should so carefully control and regulate and shape people's behaviors and the impact that has on moral development, I think, is a very interesting one. I think digital rights management, which is the big one, you know, as you said, Lessig, for example, has written endlessly about digital rights management and its many problems across every spectrum, across the entire spectrum of all the issues that you talked about. The idea of using technology as a regulator so far really has not gone well and in the way that people intended. Thank you.
Ian, thank you for those comments. It's worth noting, actually, that several of these themes are going to crop up again at other points during the lecture series. So, for example, we will have Jonathan Zittrend to actually come and talk about his work in person on the 19th of May, which will be in London. We're going to have Elizabeth Judge on the 6th of May here in Oxford, looking at the future of digital copyright reform. And Daniel Solov on the 25th of June on understanding privacy in the digital age. So many of these topics we will have time to address in more detail at a later stage.